Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Global Debt webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about debt, disaster, and corruption. And this webinar is brought to you by the Offices of Presbyterian Hunger Program, the Office of Public Witness, and Presbyterian Disaster Assistance. And with us today, we have a few friends from different of the office that I just mentioned. We have Valerie Nodam, Associate for International Hunger Concerns. We have Eileen Schumann from Mission Specialist for International Hunger Concerns too. Catherine Gordon, Representative for International Issues. Jim Kirk, Associate for Disaster Response for the National Response. And myself, Edwin Gonzalez Castillo, who works for Presbyterian Disaster Assistance for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I would like to share a little bit of the work that each of our offices do, just so you have a better understanding of our work. Presbyterian Disaster Assistance is the emergency and refugee program of the Presbyterian Church, U.S.A. that enables congregations and mission partners of the PCUSA to witness to the healing love of Christ through caring for communities adversely affected by crisis and catastrophic events. Presbyterian Hunger Program works in partnership in the United States and around the world, seeking to find out why people are hungry and encourage action that will help address the underlying causes. They approach hunger holistically, using a variety of approaches, including direct food relief combined with root cause work, sustainable development, advocacy, international and sustainable living, and education. Office of Public Witness is the public policy, information, and advocacy office of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, U.S.A. Its task is to advocate and help the church to advocate the social witness perspectives and policies of the Presbyterian General Assembly. We're grateful to have each one of them, as well as the panelists, for this wonderful event and this webinar, and we hope that it's just like we mentioned before, it's just the beginning of a series of webinars related to the conversation about debt. And now my colleague Valerie Nodam will be introducing the panelists in this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Edwin, and welcome everybody. We're very, very glad to have you, and we're very excited to have with us today 4 different speakers coming from 3 countries around the world to try to entangle this very complex but very important issue that is global debt. So today we will be joined by the Reverend Amory Tanyon Santos, who serves as the Executive Director, CEO of the Schenectady Community Ministry, which is an interfaith organization serving Schenectady in the areas of food access and community resilience. Reverend Amory has also served in parish ministry, higher theological education, and the regional religious resourcing and organizing. His journey in religious vocation, community engagement, and urban life began in his native Puerto Rico, the traditional land of the Borican Taino. Amory holds degrees from the University de Puerto Rico and Cayey, Princeton Theological Seminary, New Brunswick Theological Seminary. He's also a fellow of Duke Divinity School's Foundation of Christian Leadership and part of the Glean Network through its Shift and Start programs. Amory lives in the capital region of New York State in the traditional land of the Mohican people. He's the spouse of Jeanette and the parent of Aidan, Paul, and Sebastian Michael. Our second speaker today will be Aldo Cagliari. Aldo is the Senior Director of Policy and Strategy at Jubilee U.S.A. Aldo Cagliari served as a Senior Advisor at the Intergovernmental Group of 24 on International Monetary Affairs and Development, the G24, from 2017 to 2020. Previously, he directed the Rethinking Bretton Woods project at the Washington, D.C.-based Center of Concern from 2002 to 2017. Throughout his career, he conducted policy research and advocacy on a broad range of macroeconomic and sustainable development finance issues such as debt, tax, private finance and investment, international finance architecture, financial regulation, and trade. Cagliari presented, organized, and facilitated seminars in more than 50 countries for government officials, academics, civil society, and the private sector. His writings are published in books, academic journals, and the media, including 5 books on linkages between trade, finance, and global liquidity. Cagliari pursued master's level economic and finance studies at George Washington University in 2007 and legal studies at the Washington College of Law, American University, where he was honored with the Outstanding Graduate Award. He earned his first degree in Argentina at the University Nacional de Tucumán. Our third speaker from Sri Lanka is Sarala Emmanuel. Sarala is a feminist peace activist from Batticaloa in eastern Sri Lanka. Emerging from 2 decades of experience living and working through the war, her life and work now as a teacher, researcher, and community activist is rooted in multiple marginalized communities in eastern Sri Lanka. She's an important voice at the national level in dialogues among feminist thinkers, activists, and members of civil society on creating social discourse, policy, and plans of action on the range of issues plaguing the island nation. At the regional and international levels, Sarala is a member of feminist networks such as Sangat, South Asia, Asia Justice and Rights, and Dawn. Our last speaker today will be the Reverend Heriberto Martinez Rivera. The Reverend Heriberto Martinez Rivera started his studies in the Evangelical Seminary of Puerto Rico, concluding his master's in divinity in May of 1997. He was ordained to the Holy Ministry by the United Evangelical Church of Puerto Rico. In 1991, he was appointed administrator of that church. In August of 93, he began his first pastorate at the Evangelical Church of Capara Terrace. In October 1998, he began to pastor the Evangelical Church of Caguas, where he remained until the year 2000. In the same year, he occupied the executive secretariat of the Council of Churches of Puerto Rico, a position he held until January 25. The Reverend Martinez has participated in different ecclesiastical organizations on the island. Among them are the president of the Égida Ciudad del Retiro, president of the board of directors of the Christian Community Center, president of the Fraternity of Pastors, and since 2001, he has served as chaplain of the Senate of Puerto Rico. The most recent achievement that Reverend Martinez has achieved is that the board of directors of the Bible Society of Puerto Rico has appointed him as the new general secretary of that society. He also served as the chair of the Puerto Rico Ecumenical Coalition on Debt. So we are in very good hands today to try to untangle that conversation. Again, thank you for joining us.
Great. So now we're going to move into the substance of our discussion, and we're going to hear first from Reverend Amaury Tañón Santos, and then we'll go, he's going to talk to us a little bit about the theology of debt. Then we'll move to an overview of the global debt crisis from Aldo Cagliari. And then we'll have a panel discussion with 2 of our partners, Sarala Emmanuel and Reverend Heriberto Martinez Rivera. Reverend Amaury, tell us a little bit about the theology of debt.
Thank you, Catherine. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Albany Presbyterian, which is the community of some 60 faith communities in the greater capital region of New York State. And I pray and hope the peace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit will be with us in this, which I hope will be just the first of many conversations. Recently, I had the opportunity to join religious leaders in the Albany area to support New York State Assemblywoman Pat Fahey, who introduced the New York Taxpayer and International Debt Crisis Protection Act, calling private creditors to participate in comparable terms with sovereign debt relief initiatives being developed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund at the behest of the G20 after their spring meeting earlier this year. Among the affirmations of the bill is that 52% of the world's sovereign bonds are governed under New York state law. The bill would provide the state of New York a framework to have private creditors join the public sector, especially at the national and international level, to provide true debt relief to countries throughout the world. And it should be of no surprise to anyone at the reach of my voice that there are countries in every continent of the world whose debt is so large and held for so long that their budgets are prioritized to pay such debt. As a Puerto Rican, the issue of debt relief and sovereign debt hits home quite hard. In 2016, the U.S. Congress approved the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, ill-called La Ley Promesa. With this act, the United States confirmed the colonial nature of its relationship to the people and the government of Puerto Rico. La Junta de Control Fiscal, the Fiscal Control Board, as is known in Puerto Rico, has prioritized the payment of upwards of $70 billion in structural debt. And by doing so, Puerto Ricans are and will face decades of defunding of the country's educational, health, safety, and political infrastructures. The Puerto Rico case, of course, is not addressed in the bill that is presented at the New York State Assembly because Puerto Rico's debt is not sovereign, but a colonial one. And I will be the first one to say that although debt forgiveness is my hope, debt relief to prioritize the well-being, health, and nourishment of the peoples of the world is hopefully a good start. As one who lives and is active in New York's political and social engagements, I also hope that fellow New Yorkers will understand New York State's ability to get some significant debts rethinking going on at a global scale. And as a Christian, of course, I understand that Scripture also speaks to us about debt and is central actually to the gospel stories. The last few weeks, the Gospel of Luke has encouraged us to engage with a ubiquitous and problematic character of first century colonized Palestine, the tax collector. Luke 18, 9-14 tells the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The traditional way to interpret the message of these texts is embedded in the way verse 14 is translated. In most of our translations, verse 14 states that one man went to his house justified rather than the other. The verse goes on to paraphrase Psalm 138, verse 6. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. In and of itself, the parable interpreted in this way was quite outside of the cultural and social norm of first century Palestine. You see, tax collectors were fellow Jews whose work not only had them collect money on behalf of a violent colonizing force, that in and of itself made these characters problematic because of their position of service to the empire. That position also encouraged corruption, fraud, and debt. They were also considered to be henchmen of the empire. I recently heard a sermon on this passage where the preacher suggested that the issue of Luke 18:4 is the word we translate to rather. In Spanish, it is traditionally translated to antes que, instead of. The Greek term could also be translated to besides or alongside with. Although a teaching about being humble personified by a tax collector is already quite jarring for the audience listening to Jesus, it would have been that more revolutionary that not one, but both men would be justified. And not only justified, but justified alongside each other. Think about it. The Pharisee was praying a prayer that simply repeated the generalized sentiment of his compatriots about those who serve the empire. The tax collector, on the other hand, was praying a prayer wishing he could find forgiveness, even if from God alone and not from his compatriots. What would it be for a Jesus whose motive and means is love? And for the early church who began understanding themselves as a vessel of grace and good news, to for a moment consider and be confronted with both the cultural narratives of survival we have developed for ourselves, while at the same time to find it in our being to reconcile our relationships with each other. The Pharisee was not wrong on his prayer. He just lacked perspective. The tax collector was not wrong in his prayer. He was serving the empire. The culprit in the parable, it's neither the Pharisee or the tax collector, but the colonizing force. And because the empire is the guilty party in the parable, both men who sought the face of God through faithful prayer could leave for their homes justified, precisely because of the promise of Psalm 138, verse 6. For though the Lord is high, he regards the lowly, but the haughty he perceives from far away. As we engage in this conversation, I encourage us to keep in mind the basic and fundamental prayer Jesus taught us to pray. In the Matthew version, it is interesting how the request for forgiveness is articulated. And forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And I find it interesting because most any other part of the Lord's Prayer is a request to have the action of God double down on the reality of humanity. This part of the prayer, however, is not based on an a priori action of God. Our debts, that which we owe to God, to creation, and to our fellow human being, is asked to be forgiven in the same manner we forgive the debts others have on us. Debt is an intentional term in this text. Forgiving debts will free the indebted party to start anew. And forgiveness of debts will also free the creditor from the burden of greed and accountability over the life and livelihood of the person that he's holding the debt for. Much to think about, and a good conversation ahead led by Aldo, Sarala, and Heriberto. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Reverend Amari, for that excellent theological foundation and a sort of shift in the lens in which we view this problem and the system that's causing it. Thank you. And now we'll move on to Aldo, who's going to give us an overview of the policies that are causing this problem.
Great. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Presbyterian Church U.S.A. for the wonderful initiative to start this series to talk about this very important issue that concerns all of us today, worldwide, I would say, which is this reemergence of a debt crisis. Some of the facts now, we have more than half of the poorest countries in the world facing a debt crisis. 30% of the middle income countries also facing debt crisis. And by this, I mean what in the jargon of the IMF and the World Bank is considered unsustainable debt. So an unsustainable debt, in the way these institutions characterize it, is when a country is unable to afford it, to project that it will be able to comply with its debt obligations in the future. And so it is really a concept only about capacity to repay debt and obtain the refinancing needed to repay some of that debt. And I say that because just to highlight it, sort of a narrow concept in a way when we think about a sustainability of debt. So we are thinking about countries that may still be paying debt, but defaulting on their obligation to their own citizens on a number of priorities like health, education, social protection. So the poorest countries, for instance, at the moment, in all of them, on the average, spending on debt service already is double what they spend on health. And if you take the average of all the developing countries, they are spending on debt service 2/3 of what they spend on combined health, education, and social protection. So when you think about it in those terms, it's actually many more countries that are in crisis. And this is the message that Jubilee has been presenting for a long time, because even before the pandemic, we were saying countries are facing high burdens of debt already. And even right before the pandemic, there was a study by the World Bank talking about what the bank looked at the 5 decades of debt and found that countries were in the middle of a 4th wave of debt increase. And they said this 4th wave was the fastest, largest, and broadest based wave of debt increase that had happened in that time. So this was before the pandemic. So now you consider the pandemic and the shock that it created, and it's important to put that in perspective. The pandemic did not create the problem for many countries. It exacerbated the problems that already existed. And it's a, of course, it's the shock. The country had to increase spending to support livelihoods, to support immediate health spending, to protect their citizens. But they also, because of the lockdowns and other aspects of the pandemic, their economic activity also decreased, so their revenue also decreased. So you have this double whammy effect that exacerbated the debt problems. So it forced many countries to actually borrow even more. It's also a pandemic that had other effects, as you may be aware. 70 million people fell into poverty since 2020, and this is after 2 decades of sustained progress on reducing poverty. We were marching towards reducing poverty, eliminating it at some point. Now, since 2020, we had people fall back into poverty, 70 million. And we have also now the effects, we have to deal in those countries with the effects of what economists call the scarring effect of the pandemic, in the sense that people who lost access to schools during that time, health effects, people who are unable to work because of the impacts of the pandemic, people, losses of knowledge, human capital that essentially was lost because important parts of society, that people knowledgeable on certain things, certainly people within the medical profession, right, that were lost in many countries to the pandemic. All of this, to replenish that, it takes time. So you are thinking about countries starting and trying to resume a process of development from a lower baseline than they were before. And then after the pandemic, you have the shock of this year, the shocks of the war, and also a resurgence of inflation around the world. And in many countries, especially certainly here in the US, but also in some other advanced economies, central banks reacting to that by raising interest rates. And so when they raise interest rates, you have to think that many of these countries that had already a high level of debt, that debt was denominated in dollar, in euros, in currencies that now become more expensive compared to their own currencies. So it becomes even harder to afford that debt. That is another shock that we are facing now. And I know also an important issue to many of those attending today, the food crisis that comes with that additional inflation. Again, the food crisis was something that in many countries already had worrying levels of food insecurity before the pandemic. The pandemic, with the supply chain disruptions and other effects, made things worse. But now we face an unprecedented 345 million people around the world who are facing food insecurity. In Africa, the number of hungry increased by 1/3 just in the last 2 years. And so in 9 out of 10 countries have seen inflation of more than 5% in the price of food. Now you have to think how important in the poorest countries, 90% of the spending in a household is food. So food prices go up, and it can really wreak havoc in the finances of any household in those countries. And at the moment, you have countries where the debt crisis is combining with the food crisis. The IMF considers that there are 23 countries that are highly vulnerable to the food crisis in the world, and that number is rising every day. All of this is part of the crisis, of the debt crisis we are facing. Of course, the climate component too, and in Latin America, countries have reduced their budget for sustainability in the last 2 years by 30%. So you think about the climate objectives that the world set for itself, the international community, so all the investments that need to be made. Africa is a country that's at the front line of the food insecurity crisis, but also the climate vulnerability crisis. Because in many of these countries, the climate impact is already meaning lower harvests, less arable land, more drought, all things that make feeding the population more difficult. So all of that, it's and I was talking about this figure from Latin America where this reduction in the budget. So we're at a moment when we need to actually increase the investment on climate action. You have countries that actually are cutting down simply because they have to keep paying debt. So the initiatives that have the international community has implemented so far to respond to this was, so in the wake of the pandemic, there was a suspension of debt payments for up to 73 countries, the poorest countries, 48 countries, and this initiative only was to stop paying debt. Then it's, you have to pay later, but they could stop paying it for the time of the suspension, which ended at the end of last year. So 48 countries could access this suspension, and in total they were able to free some space in their budgets for a total of $13 billion during that time. And the other initiative is is more of a debt relief initiative, where it's called the Common Framework for Debt Treatments. That's an initiative of a group of 20, the U.S., the G7 countries, so the U.S., France, Germany, UK, Japan, but also China, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, other countries. This is the G20, the largest economies. They came together and put in place this initiative where a debtor country can apply for debt relief. And then what will happen is that the International Monetary Fund would carry out an assessment of what's the debt level of that country, how much debt relief it needs. And then the creditors would essentially, on the basis of that assessment, provide some form of debt relief to that country. So that has been the response so far. 3 countries have applied to this initiative. None of them have received debt relief so far. So we are very far from where we need to be. And there are some issues with the way this initiative is working. First of all, the fact that 3 countries that applied more than a year and a half ago are still awaiting debt relief shows you that this is a very slow initiative. We need it to something that will move faster, that will be more speedy, because a country cannot be in this limbo for such a long time. But also, it's an initiative that only applies to the 73 poorest countries. So a country like Sri Lanka, for instance, that we're going to hear more in a moment from one of the other panelists, it's a country that is not covered by that initiative. So we have to try to work out some debt relief in a different way. And there are many other countries. We have been saying consistently that the division between the low income and the middle income countries is really arbitrary. We came up with something called the Vulnerability Atlas. It's where we cover 24 countries in Latin America. They're all middle income countries, and we're looking at the vulnerability that these countries have. It's just so many issues that it's really hard to see what would be the reason to exclude those countries from a debt relief initiative, because they face a lot of the problems that come with being a developing country. They face them the same way as a low-income country. Interestingly, Haiti, which was one of the countries in that atlas when we started the exercise, was the only low-income country that we had in the atlas. And you know what? During last year, Haiti was reclassified also because it became too rich to be a low-income country. So now it is also a middle-income country. So these are some of the issues around the coverage of the initiative that we also think need to change. And then private sector participation. I was very glad that our friend, Reverend Tanyon Orozco, referred to the initiative we have ongoing in New York. This is a critical part of how to strengthen these initiatives for debt relief, because at the moment the problem we have is that 60% of the debt is in the hands of private creditors. You think about some of the achievements of that Jubilee made with others over the years, the debt relief initiatives of the early 2000s, those were possible because most of the debt was in the hands of the G7, a group of 7 countries. They had the debt, and then the World Bank and the IMF also had an important portion, but the G7 also have a large voice in those institutions. So they could get together and coordinate an initiative. But today, you have, for instance, most of the African debt payments are, most of that debt is being paid to China, which is not one of the G7 countries. It is in the G20. But also you have 60% of the debt of all the Middle East developing countries is to the private creditors. So the initiative that the G20 set up requires that the private creditors participate on comparable terms, so that they are supposed to provide similar proportion of debt relief as the France, the U.S., China, other public, other countries provide. But it has no way of enforcement. It relies on the goodwill of really appealing to these creditors and saying that they should join the initiative. And guess what? So far, the private creditors have not joined, have not contributed their share. So the initiative in New York is one of several that we are supporting. We are trying all routes possible to get to the objective of ensuring the private creditors are going to face some incentive, that they are going to be compelled to provide their share of debt relief in these initiatives. But at the moment, this is another important shortcoming of the debt relief initiatives that we have in place, that the international community has provided. I think I'll stop there for now, and maybe in the Q&A portion, we can get to some other points. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Aldo, for that overview of this really tragic crisis that we're facing and the overwhelming debt burdens that many of our partners in the developing world are facing. So thank you. And we'll return to Aldo after our panel to find out more about what we can do to take action on this. Now we're going to move to hear from 2 of our partners, Sarala Emmanuel from Sri Lanka, and Heriberto Martinez Rivera, Reverend Heriberto Martinez Rivera from Puerto Rico, to hear some more in-depth analysis of how their countries have become indebted, who's responsible, and sort of what are the consequences. I'd like to start with you, Sarala. What has caused the debt crisis in your country, and who is responsible for that?
Hello, everyone. It's very, very nice to be here with this group and hear other speakers who are speaking kind of similar thoughts and similar analysis, because it's very rare, let me say, it's particularly around the Sri Lankan crisis as well. To answer your question, I think Sri Lanka's debt crisis is not a sudden thing. It didn't come out of the blue. We've had a particular economic model, kind of a neoliberal economic model since 1977-78, which has led us to where we are now. So some of the key features of it is that we stopped investing in agriculture. and our economy is fully driven by exports and imports, and we import food. So one of the speakers earlier mentioned about the food crisis, and we are like a great example of that because we are heavily dependent on importing food. That's why we're in this crisis. People are just unable to manage, and there's so much hunger and starvation. There's this, just to give an example, 1 in 7 children now have dropped out of school because they're not eating, they're hungry, and there's no access to food, and they're unable to get to school, or even if they're in school, to concentrate. Some of the other reasons is that because our exports never generated enough remittances to cover our import bill, which was huge, we started, taking loans, and then of course this whole vicious cycle of getting more loans to pay off other loans, and somehow I guess even with a huge war for 30 years, the economy kind of stumbled along, and then from 2007 we got labeled as a middle-income country. It was very funny to hear you talk about that also. Where I live, which is in the east of Sri Lanka, that is like I mean, we're like, where is the middle income country you're talking about? And since then, I think Sri Lanka started borrowing in private kind of capital markets, and our international sovereign bonds is the 40% of our debt. And that's been the slippery slope we have gone down in. So this is just some of the economic analysis. I would like to say that there are also huge political and governance issues, and I'm sure in many parts of the world they go hand in hand. And our crisis is also a political crisis. And again, it's not something out of the blue. The economic decisions that were made, and the kind of priorities given to particular kinds of construction loans, where that money was used, etc., are all political decisions. So they go hand in hand. That also has a history that's not a pretty picture for Sri Lanka. So I'd leave it there, and I can add more as we go along.
Can you say a little bit more about the sort of gendered impact of the debt crisis and how it affects women, particularly in Sri Lanka?
Of course, the impact is, so where I am, the economy is mainly rural. It's agriculture and fisheries, there are lagoons. So the agriculture sector has been very badly affected as well. And women are 40% of the agriculture sector also. And women are predominantly in the plantation economy. We are also like still one of our major economic sectors is the plantation economy, coming from kind of colonial structures. So that's mostly women. Then after we opened the economy, it has been the garments sector and migrant workers, women who go as domestic workers to West Asia. So these are the 3 sectors that bring in the foreign currency, and they are very exploitative and extremely precarious work that women are in. And that has been really affected in the economic crisis as well. There's huge pressure, and now there are more and more and more people who are unable to manage here, who are leaving as migrant workers, women and men. And clearly it's a state strategy because they are relaxing regulations and certain like policies to enable people to leave. Just as an example, there was a criteria saying that women who have children under 5 cannot go as migrant workers. Now that's been removed, or it's been reduced to women who have children under 2. So the state is also pushing that as the recovery strategy to send more people as migrant workers to bring in the foreign currency. So these are some of the impacts on women's labor in Sri Lanka that we are seeing, apart from the impact on the household and the increase, doubling, tripling increase of burden on care work. Women are basically carrying the kind of burden of living through, surviving this economic crisis at the household level.
Thank you, Sarala. Reverend Heriberto, can you say a little bit about the situation in Puerto Rico? What caused the debt crisis there and who is responsible?
Sure, it's a pleasure for me. Primero que nada, quiero agradecer a la Iglesia Presbiteriana por este
Before I do anything else, I would like to thank the Presbyterian
importante
Church
taller
for
conferencia,
inviting me to this very important
sobre todo,
seminar, especially
para hablar un poco de la necesidad y la urgencia de trabajar con las
so that
crisis de la
we
deuda,
can talk
no
about
solamente en Puerto
the
Rico, sino a través del
importance and
mundo,
how urgent it is
de
to
una forma holística
on debt, not only in Puerto Rico, but all over the world in a holistic
en
way.
Puerto Rico y en todos los países que viven esta
In Puerto
dificultad
Rico,
económica.
in every place else where they are facing these economic difficulties.
Puerto Rico enfrenta la crisis económica y social más severa en nuestra
Puerto
historia
Rico is
reciente,
facing
con una
the
deuda
most
pública de 72
severe
mil millones de
economic
dólares.
and
Y los
social
planes de
crisis,
pensión
public debt
básicamente
of
sin dinero.
72
Cerca del 60% de nuestra niñez
million
vive
dollars.
en niveles de pobreza.
Almost
La
70% of
tasa de
our children
desempleo
live
ronda sobre el
at the poverty
12%, que
level.
duplica la media de
Unemployment
los
is
Estados Unidos.
12%.
También enfrentamos
Heriberto,
graves problemas de reducción
Yeah.
de nuestra población debido
Heriberto, I'm sorry. Well, you're muted now. But can you choose? ¿Puedes escoger el canal de español, por favor?
He's
Está-
unmuted, so the interpreter cannot hear him.
Estás muted, Heriberto. Ahora.
Puerto Rico is facing the most severe economic and social crisis. It has a $72 billion debt. Pension plans have almost no money. Almost 60 or 70% of our childhood is at the poverty level. And our unemployment rate is almost double that of the United States. And our Puerto Rican brethren are emigrating to the United States. Why to the United States? Which is because Puerto Rico is a territory, which is another nice way of saying a colony. The question is, how will we face this from a humanitarian and social justice perspective? We can't just close the door and turn the light off as if everything had been done. We have to find a way to find justice for all members of society. There are many countries in developing countries that are facing this issue, and there's no way to face debt with a transparent way. There is a lot of corruption. It's almost a pandemic. The economic crisis in Puerto Rico started in the 2000, but it doubled during the last decade. In 2005, the United States decided to eliminate a tax exemption for American companies that were benefiting when they were in Puerto Rico. One of the problems is that the model of industrialization in Puerto Rico was based in creating a tax paradise, giving several exemptions for taxes. In '76, Washington allowed American companies that operate on the island to send their earnings to their headquarters without having to pay taxes on the gains they were generating. This caused many of these companies started reducing when the code was changed. Many of these companies started reducing operations, and many of them closed in Puerto Rico. So employment has been reduced, and manufacturing jobs have been reduced to almost 40%. So the GDP has been reduced. This is a crisis for many companies. Unemployment keeps going up. There is also a banking crisis. There was corruption going on in the financing system, and some banks were closed. So in order to close the deficit created by the lack of money, the Puerto Rican government started acquiring debt very quickly with a complex combination of mutual funds until we got to the point of having this $72 billion debt. Debt didn't stop growing. And in 2015, the government of Puerto Rico declared the payable debt impayable, non-payable. Because Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, we have no ability to make important decisions as far as what we can do to overcome the crisis. Nor were we able to benefit from the bankruptcy code of the United States like Detroit did it before. In 2016, Barack Obama signed what is called in Spanish, Ley Promesa, created a board of financial oversight to achieve access to capital markets and fiscal responsibilities. I want to say something. You believe U.S.A., we have a relationship with them. Obviously, they opened the doors, and we're very appreciative of the relationship. They opened us the doors to reach out and be able to Puerto Rico be allowed some kind of instrument to restructure the debt. Obviously, we are endlessly grateful for the help they have provided. The following year, in 2017, when there was no agreement, the governor of Puerto Rico appealed to Title III of the Ley Promesa, Promise Law, in a process under the supervision of the federal court. If efforts to reach a voluntary consensus are not achieved. Obviously, Puerto Rico has gone through many difficult situations in 2017. For example, we had two hurricanes. Maria destroyed our infrastructure. It took a year to rebuild our electrical system. We were almost 3.5 months without electricity. It was for sure a major crisis. Rebuilding work, or rather the work for restructuring the debt. We also had earthquakes in 2020, and after that we had the pandemic. So basically on March 16th, the entire country was closed. And then to add more difficult situations, the war in Ukraine that began in February, it also affected us. Because we depend on oil to produce electricity. And when the cost of oil went up, the cost of producing electricity went up as well. in Puerto Rico's case, the U.S. government had no choice but to come up with a mechanism for the ley promesa, which left us working only on one side. The debt has two sides or two prongs: debt restructuring, and the other finding alternatives for economic development. None of that happened. If there is no economic development, the debt will hardly be paid. It is important to us so that Puerto Rico doesn't end up in a situation like this. We have to prioritize economic development that increases sustainable development, sustainable infrastructure. It is important to work on our electric grid in an efficient manner. All the interested parties must prioritize the financing as much as it is possible in ways that help overcome poverty for our children, and also protecting the island from climate change issues. That's what's affecting Puerto Rico. On September the 18th, we also had a hurricane, Category 1, that had a severe impact on the south of the island. As a religious man and as a Puerto Rican, there should be an auditing of the debt as a mechanism to end corruption and impunity. That is paramount. As long as we don't know what happened with the money that led us to this huge debt, transparency and accountability must be the main part in a democracy. Citizens must participate. It is important for the well-being of a nation. Puerto Rico needs to pay immediate attention in a democratic way. The relationship we have with the United States. We need to find a responsible way with this for this situation.
Yeah, thank you, Reverend Heriberto.
We can't, at the end of the 21st century, be this way. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks to you both. You've both shown, Jubilee has a metaphor for debt, just breaking the chains of debt. And you've both shown how the debt is really keeping people in chains, in bondage to these debt repayments, and really undermines a lot of the other issues that we're concerned about, like climate justice, gender justice, resiliency in terms of disasters. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how Reverend Amari talked a little bit in the beginning in the theological context of addressing the system. How are you organizing in your own contexts? Like, what have been your successes? How are you addressing this issue? And Sarada, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, I think our focus has been well, let me say it like this. Initially, there was a lot of hope. I think some of you may have seen what happened in Sri Lanka. I think by April, May, there was a lot of hope that we can actually bring about a kind of a political systemic change. We have never seen that kind of people's movements coming on the street and demanding for change and accountability. So there was a lot of hope. But of course, like if other parts of the world, I mean, the system kind of protects itself. Business protects politics protects business, and it kind of reinforced itself with military power and laws, etc. And now the protests it's still ongoing, but it's much harder and dangerous. So in that space, what we've been doing is like working in kind of smaller groups in the rural economies where we are based, and with women's groups, doing two things. Let's say three things. One is educate, right? The exact questions that the Reverend also raised, like where has the money gone? What is this debt? What was it used for? Why are we paying it back? Who is responsible for this? And kind of in very simple ways, trying to have teach outs in communities, using theater, using discussions, etc., so that people are aware and are asking these questions, right? Secondly, we are of course also continuing to protest in very different ways, because one can't have just one form of resistance, especially when that form of resistance then attracts kind of repression from the state. So from silent walks to using creative forms of showing dissent and resistance, there's such a diversity of emerging of such a diversity of groups and ways of asking questions and resisting what's going on now. And thirdly, we've been talking with women about what, like, I mean, all this is good, but if there is no food on the table today, then your children are hungry, right? So what do we do about the immediate needs while we hold the state accountable? And for that kind of to encourage and like work out ways of having collectives for support, for care, collective agriculture, kind of producer groups, etc. Now, this is easier said than done. First of all, we are used to a kind of a neoliberal model of kind of very individualized ways of working, doing business, owning land, owning resources, etc. So to move from that to imagining something kind of like as a shared resource, sharing land, sharing labor, it's not easy. It requires mind and kind of changing in outlook, not thinking about profit or understanding profit in different ways, let's say. So it requires that, and then also practically the land is not used to, the land is so full of chemicals and chemical based agriculture that changing from that to any other kind of production is not going to give yields immediately, which is what we are seeing. And also the whole agriculture sector has been using GM seeds. So even to kind of, so what we are doing is trying to find traditional knowledge on seeds. There are older generation farmers, women farmers also, who have been protecting seeds. So kind of finding them, sharing them with each other, sharing knowledge, etc. I don't want to make it sound romantic. It's not enough. It's not going to bring food to the table of every single household, but at least we are people are imagining different ways of kind of looking after each other, a different kind of economy, like a caring economy that puts people first, as well as then asking questions from the state. Just to say, I'm sure this is the case in other countries also, the IMF, but not just the IMF, the general neoliberal view is that there should be targeted support to so-called identified people who are identified as being under a poverty line, and it's cash grants. I mean, the World Bank has rolled out 2-3 rounds of cash grants, right? And in Sri Lanka now, poverty is at like 42%. Some of the university economists have said, you know, half the population has fallen into poverty. So like, what are you talking about? You know, what kind of targeting? It's ridiculous. And to have then cash grants when the food inflation is at 90%, it's absolutely, I mean, I was reading a recent report, you know, feminists have called it pink washing of austerity, which is exactly what is happening. You use the right lingo, but actually it's just like, it's absolutely meaningless. So to kind of demand for universal social safety nets, demand for universal food distribution systems, is those ideas, to kind of spread that idea among people is what we are trying to do, rather than hitting, I mean, along with hitting your head against that big wall, which you call the state, one needs to also kind of build that momentum, right? And for people to articulate alternatives. Like you were saying, Reverend, like, I mean, it's not enough to say, you know, the leadership, Gota, who's the former president, should go, or this, you know, we need elections, or to even say restructure the debt, or to even say cancel the debt, when your economic model is going to get you back there in like a couple of years. And what is the IMF doing? They are giving us another loan, right? So, I mean, it's not a sustainable way of moving out of this kind of debt-ridden economic model. So these are some of the things we are kind of focusing on and trying to do. And meanwhile, also building alliances with other kind of protest groups in other parts of the country, other women farmer collectives, doing research, generating knowledge, educating kind of young people also about what we want differently.
Thank you, Soraya. That was a good picture of all of the different ways and all of the different targets involved in changing the situation. Reverend Heriberto, do you want to say something about the work that's being done in Puerto Rico?
Well, the ecumenical coalition, basically, this is the religious group that covers the Catholics and the Protestants. We're doing a lot of activities supporting the people in different struggles. In 2019, in summer 2019, Puerto Rico organized itself, and thanks to that social organization, we were able to achieve overthrow people that were in power. So that was a historical deal that the people were able to do, and we look for respect. And in other areas, we're trying to develop that work, the ant work in different communities, trying to be able to develop education about important issues in our country, to organize ourselves and be able to participate in a more conscious way. This month, we are gonna have other type of manifestations that deal with the renegotiation of a company that privatizes in Puerto Rico, that Puerto Rico gave them the production of all the power in Puerto Rico. So we are working against corruption because it's a big problem. We have the resources and the capacity here in Puerto Rico to assume the responsibility as we should, but they don't want to do it because the business is not good for them if it's done the right way, in a responsible way. So the work of the church of our people, is to restructure debt, is to insist in having an audit of the debt of Puerto Rico, because so much money, we don't know what happened with that money and where did it go. The government doesn't want to do an audit at all. The government of the United States, through the Fiscal Supervision Board, that is what is allowing the corruption and the impunity. So we do have, we are doing work in different social areas. We're trying, one thing that we're trying to look, facing the economical crisis, the people from Puerto Rico are trying to create opportunities to create work. So we are trying to create small businesses. That's what people of Puerto Rico are trying to do, to generate more work opportunities with small businesses. We are we're trying to deal with that because we don't have the opportunity to make decisions. So we depend on the United States Congress to look for justice in front of this economical crisis.
Thanks to you both. We're out of time for the panel. We're going to move to Aldo now, but I think you've given us a really good picture about how irresponsible lending and irresponsible borrowing is really felt by the people, and the pain of those irresponsible decisions are really balanced on the back of the people, and also some good ideas for solutions and the power of collective action and working together. I saw some comments in the chat. Someone from Colombia has said it's good to hear from you all that you all are facing the same problems that they are facing. So thank you. And now we're going to move to Aldo for a call to action.
Thank you. Well, I think this is the moment where we wanted to take the opportunity to ask you to join in some of these actions, some of the activities we are carrying out, demanding changes to the way the international financial system and debt work. So I outlined some of the problems, and of course we are proposing solutions, and you know, the bodies that need to put in place these solutions, the leaders, especially in the G20 countries, need to hear our voices. So one of the first thing I wanted to ask, this petition we have addressed to the G20, to the group of 20. There's a petition for organizations that's already signed by 286 organizations around the world. We have it on our website. Maybe if Eileen would be so kind, in the blog, at the bottom of the first blog, I think we have those links. So there's a petition for organizations, and there is a petition for individuals also, and we continue periodically to we continue to gather signatures, and those have been increasing, and we keep sending it to the G20 leaders. And we also send it to the head of the IMF and the head, the chair of the G20, and also to our own President Biden here in the White House. And also in terms of the action in New York, I mentioned the legislation, Reverend Amori too, and we, in this case, we have a letter. It's a sign-on letter to lawmakers in New York. We welcome signatures from any organization, but I think it's important, especially that the lawmakers in New York hear from organizations in New York, because they are more likely to respond to organizations that are in their districts, the organizations that vote them. So these are New York State Assembly members and senators. And that letter, so if you are not based in New York, we still ask you, please ask if you have friends, relatives, partners, people you know in New York who can sign their organization or disseminate it to other people who can sign it. That would be really very appreciated to help us build support for this legislation. It's like I said, I don't think I said this. 50%, more than 50% of the private debt is under the legislation of New York. So changing this legislation is really strategic, can have a lot of impacts on the claims that private creditors around the world have against developing countries. Third thing, we also, and Catherine mentioned the chains of debt. So we had an action just at the World Bank and the IMF met last October for the annual meetings. They meet twice in the year. The next meeting will be in April of next year. And so at these last meetings, we had an action. We tried to visibilize our calls. In the way we did it was to have paper chains, and then we marched with those paper chains in front of the institutions when the leaders were meeting. So this would be prominently shown and reported and attract attention. And we think it is important to have these actions, so we, in a way, we can continue to, especially, in the developed world, we feel that there is a sense of now more distance. During the pandemic, there was a moment where there was a feeling that we needed to act, but that seems to be farther and farther behind, especially as the advanced economies have been able to take off, and developing countries haven't really been able to take off so fast. But it's important to show to the leaders that this is still an important issue, that they need to act, and many countries are expecting them to act. And this is one way to do it. So all of that introduction to say, in April, we hope to have a similar action, and we hope more of you can join, can be present. We are having calls with, so I would encourage you also to consider becoming a Jubilee congregation or a faith community. We have 700 of those. We have calls every month for congregations where we talk about this opportunity for action. So we would encourage you to join and be part of those calls. And you can write to me or to, you'll find information for contacting us in the jubileeusa.org website. So that would be another way you can join on those actions. And I think it's also important, if anything you can do to help disseminate. I'm sure that the colleagues at the Presbyterian Church are going to have this video posted somewhere, so to share it. It's important that people hear more about this, that people are aware of the issues and the actions that could be taken, where the change could come from. So anything you can do to help disseminate some of the materials that you have also seen on the chat would also be helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and we'll be sending out more information, and this is a webinar series, so we'll also have additional webinars that will look into this issue even more concretely. And I just wanted to say that the Jubilee and Peace U.S.A. have been partners in this work for decades. One of the directors of the Office of Public Witness back in the early 2000s actually spoke with I think President Clinton at the time when the legislation was signed, I think around 2000, and we've been partnered. My predecessor helped to write the legislation. So this is an issue that has been of major concern for Presbyterians over 20 years. And Jubilee has been a very important partner in that. So thank you, Aldo. And we want to move to questions now. And we have a big question. It might take up the rest of our time for all of the panelists. Could any of you share how we could frame debt cancellation, debt relief as concrete positive action for climate justice, for racial justice, or for democracy building? And maybe we can start with Reverend Almery, if he's still on with us.
I am, and thank you for calling me. And I was typing some of the responses, so I'll summarize what I wrote on the chat. One, for those of us who live in jurisdictions where some of these sovereign bonds are held, like we heard from Aldo, over 52% of the sovereign debt that we're talking about, right? That the G20 and the IMF and the General Monetary Fund and the World Bank are dealing with were contracted in New York State, right? So there are real legal and effective ways for local governments, such as New York. There's similar laws that have been passed in the United Kingdom, and there's a similar process out of Australia. That could give local governments like that of New York State the ability to engage with private bondholders, to work on this. The other thing that I'll say, this might be an oversimplification of the issue, but I appreciated both how Sarala and Heriberto painted the picture of what's going on in Sri Lanka and Puerto Rico. What happened recently, the political crises, because of the uprising of the people, right, that we saw in Sri Lanka recently, and that which happened in Puerto Rico in 2019 with the overthrow of the governor of Puerto Rico, it's not a one-off situation. It's the consequence of decades of this, right? That seemed to have happened One, without the intentional oversight of those governments and private institutions that were providing these debts, right? And like both Heriberto and Sarala said, without knowledge, neither in the governments and certainly not of the people, of how these monies were being spent, right? So there is a direct correlation, it's historic, right, of how these debts affect the ability of any government to be able to prioritize their own people, right? You know, the third example that I'll give, I mean, we can give multiple examples, is that of Haiti, right? You know, Haiti has lived in a consistent and constant debt situation because after independence, the government of France charged the government of Haiti for property lost. And the property lost that was lost was that of slaves, right? The reason why Haitians fought for independence, which was to free their slaves, has been the situation that has put them in the current political and economic crisis they are in. So relieving this debt, and better yet, cancellation, but we can parse that out however we want, will begin to give governments the ability not only to prioritize the well-being of their people, but it will return to the people the ability to build a true democratic infrastructure. I think it was Sarala who said that you can't expect the people of Sri Lanka to trust in the financial and political structures of the country that has gotten us to this place. So there are solutions. I think Heriberto was mentioning this. The people of Sri Lanka, the people of Puerto Rico, the people of Haiti, just to give those three examples, have ideas about how to solve this issue. But in order for them to be able to build resilient democratic infrastructures, we need to realize the real cost, literally, that the debt is having in the wellness and well-being of these people.
Thank you. Sarala, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Yeah, I mean, I would say even in these kind of dark times, it's also a moment of possibilities and opportunities for us to reimagine, right? Like, and I think that's especially to kind of reimagine the economy in a different way, because it's not just about the debt, it's about how the whole economy is structured, it's gendered, it's patriarchal, it's exploitative. And can we think of economic relations which are different to just profit making, right? So I think what we need to do is to kind of have conversations like this across kind of national boundaries. We have been struggling to, because in Sri Lanka, there are very, very few people who let's say, who our thoughts kind of align, right? Usually we are hitting our heads against people who are very much believe in the IMF and believe in the current economic model. And you know, economists, they're very intimidating. Usually they throw lots of data at you, and it's hard to have any kind of conversation. So across national boundaries, like trying to find others, smaller groups who are working on similar issues. So today, I mean, there's people from Colombia, from Puerto Rico, Sri Lanka, like that. People's movements actually get together and say, you know, this is happening here, this is happening here. So actually, you know, 50% of the problem is us, sure, right? But 50% of the problem is also the global economic system, which has no accountability. And how do we hold those global systems accountable? How do we call for cancellation of this kind of debt, right? So to develop the language, to develop the analysis, I think it's really important to keep doing that and to do it in a way which is clear, simple, and it's transferable, right? It cannot only be at a level where you have to be an economist to understand it. It has to be knowledge, because it means something. I mean, I have, like, just speaking to a group of rural women farmers, it makes sense to them. It's not like they're like, oh my God, this is why this is happening. And why am I paying this debt, right? Why am I punished? Why am I being taxed, right? So people can relate. You just need that little bit of making the connections, and then it makes absolutely, like, you know, so much sense for people that this is unjust and this is not okay and this needs to change. So to kind of simplifying information, right now we are struggling with trying to simplify, understand and articulate what we really want to say about tax. Every day when we go for a daily protest walk, we are having conversations about, okay, apart from saying we don't want this value-added tax, what more can we say about tax justice? So having information about how others have kind of articulated it, explained it, and shown the unfairness of it, then that would help us here also, right? Because the new budget is coming up for debate in Parliament next week. Like no idea what how it's going to look, but I'm sure there's going to be massive like austerity measures in there for sure. So alliances across national boundaries continue to generate analysis and knowledge. So today I learned a lot. It was really good to be in this forum, and simplifying and like spreading it like across kind of communities across the world, so that we build that momentum slowly, right? That would be my response.
Yeah, I think these kind of discussions are very empowering, seeing that we're not alone in the struggles that we're facing. We're almost out of time. I'm going to check with our tech. Eileen, are there any last words that are follow-up?
Well, I think we're recording this webinar, so we will be sending out recordings to everybody who registered, both in English and in Spanish, and we'll send out a number of resources, including the action items that Aldo went over. And also we'll be letting you know when we plan future webinars on this topic, this important topic, and just really want to give thanks to all of our speakers and panelists for their time and preparation for this, as well as for our planning team. We're really excited to dive into this subject more, to learn alongside all of you, and to hopefully engage the Presbyterian Church and others in this important work that has such a huge impact just across the world. So thank you all.
And thanks to you, Eileen. Eileen did all of the heavy lifting on this, and we really appreciate all the work that she's done. And thank you to all the panelists.